Hello, my name is John Barrett. I'm an instructor with Online Trading Academy in Mumbai. So in this video today, I'm going to be talking about the use of trailing stops. It won't take too long in this video. I'm going to explain some interesting features about trailing stops. One thing I've seen about trailing stops is that people misuse them almost completely. They misunderstand what use they would have to you and how you might be able to use them. Trailing stops are a great thing, a relatively new thing, I think. Not all the BSE is supporting trailing stops now. The NSE will hopefully soon, but these are kind of new things to people, being able to implement a trailing stop in your account as you go. Now, one thing that you don't want to do with a trailing stop is to initiate the trailing stop on entry. A trailing stop, in my opinion, is best used to hold a stock for a long period of time. So when we enter the stock here, we would not want to put on it. Actually, let me move this over a little bit here. We'd enter a position here. We don't want to initially enter a trailing stop. Very often, one thing that happens with trailing stops, people want to use a very small trailing stop. And I'm going to explain why that is, why the motivation is, and why they don't work to use a very, very tight trailing stop. But people want to put on a trailing stop is, why wouldn't I just go ahead and put a trailing stop here and then allow it to just rise with price and just trail it up until it stops me out? Well, the problem is usually that the trailing stop size would be too small to be able to hold the trade. And let me show you, a typical chart's going to look something like this. Stock moves up and down like this. Hopefully, that would be normal for a stock to look like that. Now, the problem with that would be that this wouldn't be big enough to be able to hold the stock. So often, once we become profitable in a trade, we could look at putting a trailing stop. And very often for me, I leave this stop on, especially in a longer term trade like a multi-day swing trade. I will leave this stop in place for quite some time. But once the stock gets well into the profit, now I'm starting to think, well, maybe I don't want to exit this trade at the target price. Maybe my target was here. Maybe I've got a level here that I've identified and I say, there's my target. But I'd like to be able to continue this trade and maybe take advantage of the higher pricing, that it goes higher. And I often do that in my trading. Part of my trading plan would say, well, if the market is going in my favor strongly and the trade is going well, then I'll use a trailing stop and let the profits run. But you'll notice, if we put a trailing stop in place once we've achieved here and we decided from here forward to use a trailing stop, how big a trailing stop would it take? The trailing stop would have to be the largest of these pullbacks here. I call pullbacks or retracements. It would have to accommodate the largest of these in order to achieve this price. It's pretty simple, really, but people fail to recognize that. Why? Well, because what people don't want to happen is they don't want to give up this amount of money at the end of the trade. So whenever they do get out, they want out at the top. So logic tells them, use a very small trailing stop, and that way I won't give up very much money when I do get out of this trade. The problem is they can never achieve this with a very tight trailing stop. You can't have both. You can't have, typically in the market, you can't have a tight stop and big profits. They don't work hand in hand. So really, using trailing stops, you need to come to grips with a couple of things. One is that you're not going to be able to hold the thing with a very tight trailing stop, and that you're not going to get out at the top. One of the biggest things I see wrong with traders is they think they're supposed to get out at the top or very, very close to the top all the time. Therefore, they go set a tight trailing stop and they end up stopped out here, and they never achieve this, and they're constantly frustrated with that because they're too tight with the stops. It takes quite a large trailing stop to hold many of these stocks. Part of the way you can tell how large a trailing stop should be is you look at an intraday chart. Look at the amount, what I call a wiggle. How much wiggle did it take to hold this thing? And that's what you do to kind of determine that. So you can actually measure that and go, this thing, the maximum drawdown or the maximum pullback in this thing was, 40 or 30 rupees or something. And if I was going to try to hold it, that's what I would have to accommodate. Well, that's a large amount, which might be in a larger chart. But even smaller amounts, you just can't get to where you have a few rupee stop. You'll never be able to achieve the larger gains that you're looking for. So people constantly misuse trailing stops. Another way to use a trailing stop is to, as you approach the end of your trade. And I'm prone to do this with trailing stops, that when you think about it, you have this as your area if you're looking for a target. And as you approach this, we entered the trade here. And as we start to approach this target, now the risk reward, the amount of risk that I have to my stop and the amount of reward that I might have remaining is not that much. I mean, I have, it's disproportionate. So what I want to do is I want to possibly use a relatively tight trailing stop towards the end of this trade. And in effect, as we approach the end, the target here, that trailing stop might be tighter even. So that because what ends up happening often we realize, and in our classes we teach that this area might be a place where the market's likely to turn sharply. So I don't want to have, I want to be exiting close and maybe have that stop relatively close up here. Not much is left. Another thing to think about, people fail to recognize about trailing stops and about is approaching the end of the day. You know, does it make sense to hold this trade into the close, even though I'm a multi-day trader? Should I take the inherent overnight risk for the remainder when my target is so small? This is something that you just have to judge on every trade, but think about it. Does it make sense? And that's going to play out in every trade. It can be different almost for every trade. So the idea is you start getting closer to your target. Now tighter trailing stops may make sense, but you'll never achieve these with tight trailing stops. Those are one of the biggest misconceptions about trailing stops. So don't be so tight with trailing stops that you can't let your trades breathe. That's why I like to say it. They can't breathe. You're choking them down and to give them no opportunity to run. So we want to allow these things to take place. You know, sometimes you might get this happen where you have a pretty big trailing stop and you end up coming down and getting stopped out here. And so you will say, oh, I saw this much money but I only made this. Well, you still made this. And over time, what you're going to find out is you'll make more money by using proper trailing stops. And one of the best ways to size them, let the chart tell you what the trailing stop should be by its previous price activity. There's all kind of math function you can use, but usually doesn't work very well because there's no blanket amount really that works here. You're better learning to judge these size of required trailing stop by what the chart tells you should do. Anyway, so that's, I thought I'd just share that with you on trailing stops. Some of the common mistakes about trailing stops that I constantly see with people completely misunderstand trailing stops. They can be a great tool for us, but they also can really cause us problems by using too small. All right, so thank you very much for watching the video. Come by and see us at Online Trading Academy in Mumbai. We give a free workshop. We'll show you all about what we do there, and come by and take a look. You can visit us on web at www.onlinetradingacademy.com/Mumbai. Take a look at our website. Come by for a free workshop. Thank you very much.